In this segment, we're going to take a look at some of the determinants of labor demand, or what factors determine the location and slope of the demand curve in the labor market model. We'll consider the presence of substitutes for labor in the market. We'll consider complements. We'll look at demand for the output good that is being produced by labor. We'll look at the cost of other input factors, labor being an input to production, of course, and there are other inputs. And then we'll consider some exogenous factors such as presence of contracts or possibly even some other forms of market friction. First, let's consider the presence of a substitute. So to begin with, a substitute is going to be something that could produce instead of labor. So immediately, when we think about substitutes, I think we have to consider capital as a substitute for labor. And when we think about capital today, we're increasingly thinking about robotics, other forms of equipment, and various changes in technologies. So let's think about this. If we have a demand for an output good that is relatively constant, and we have a change in, say, the price of labor, so if wage rises, then we know that's going to lead to a decline in labor, and assuming our basic downward sloping labor demand curve, then we would expect, if the demand for the output good has remained constant and we have seen an increase in the cost of labor, that would then cause us to have a reduced level of labor that is demanded. We then would expect to have an increased demand for the substitute for this. So we might have an increased demand in robotics or equipment. So when labor shifts downward, then the demand for robotics or other equipment or maybe some technology would rise to make up for it. So the presence of these substitutes will affect the labor market. Let's think about this just from the opposite standpoint. Let's assume for a moment that the price of robotics decreases dramatically and that the price of labor remains constant and that the demand for the output good remains constant. Well, if the price of robotics falls, then we would expect the number of robot units to rise. That would lead to a decline in the number of labor units. So we see a negative correlation between the substitute and the original unit. You might recall that this is just the opposite of how we defined this when we looked at elasticity. We considered that the substitute had a positive correlation, but it wasn't a correlation to the substitute, so the quantity of one versus the quantity of the other. It was the price of one versus the quantity of the other. And if we look at this here, we can look at the price and the quantity. They're both going in the same direction, so they're positively correlated, but that's for elasticity. When we're simply looking at the quantities, we see a negative correlation. One rises, the other falls, and again, that's presuming that the demand for the output good remained constant and the price of the other good remained constant in the face of a price change, perhaps, of the substitute itself. Well, let's think about this differently from the standpoint of a complement. If a substitute is something that could be used to substitute for the labor unit, then maybe a complement is something that goes along with the labor unit. So let's think about this. Let's say that we're manufacturing a home and that our labor is a carpenter in this case. Well, I would think that a complement to a carpenter in the manufacture of a home might be a plumber. Because in most homes, I think we have both walls and pipes. Maybe there's even another complement, an electrician. So if the quantity of plumbers needed rises, then I think we would expect for the quantity of carpenters needed to also rise. Because if we need more plumbers, apparently we're building more homes, we're going to need more carpenters. Now you might think of this just the opposite. You might suppose that the carpenter comes before the plumber. That's probably true. So if we need more carpenters, if the quantity there rises, then we also need more plumbers, or electricians, or plasterers, etc. And the correlation then is positive. An increase in one is going to lead to an increase in another when we're talking strictly about the quantity unit. Again, when we dealt with elasticity, we saw an opposite relationship in the operator, but that's because we were looking at price. So demand for labor demand for one type of labor is going to be at least somewhat predicated on the demand for another type of labor, whether it's a complement or a substitute. Let's think about this in respect to the demand for the output good. So we have a basic goods market model. Let's say that we're manufacturing shoes, and we have a price and quantity for the shoe. We have some supply of shoes. We have some consumer demand for shoes, and those, of course, have resulted in our basic Q star and P star relationship. Well, if the demand for shoes rises, we've gone from D to D1, then we would expect that the demand for labor as an input would also rise. So if we then had wage and labor, and we had some supply of labor and some labor demand, if the demand for the input, or rather the output good rises, then we would similarly expect an increase in the demand for the input factor as well. Let's consider the costs of other inputs. So this is going to come back and touch a little bit on the issue of complements. So let's assume again that we're dealing with shoes. And shoes use leather and labor in their production. Now you and I know that they use much more than that, but just try to simplify this. And let's assume for a moment that we have a basic goods market model with some quantity and some price, some supply and some demand, with again our P star relationship and our Q star relationship. Again, these are indicative of a market that clears. And let's assume that the profit margin is constant. So it's fixed. Let's also assume then that the price of leather goes up. So price of leather rises. Well, if the price of leather rises, and if leather and labor are complements in the manufacturing of a shoe, then that's going to increase the price that the shoe has to be sold for in order for this profit margin to remain constant. So let's say we're moving to P prime. It's going to decrease the quantity of leather in this marketplace to Q prime, or the quantity for shoes in this marketplace for Q prime, which then is going to decrease the quantity of labor. So as the price of leather rose, the quantity for leather fell, and the quantity for its complement in production, labor, also fell. Now, this is no different than we just saw when we considered complements in this part of the segment. Now let's think about the presence of contracts. Largely when we think about contracts in the labor market, we're either thinking about executive contracts, or we might be thinking about union contracts. So let's assume we have some labor supply, we have some labor demand, some L, and some W, yielding some W star, and some L star. And let's say that these are for production workers. And let's assume that a union has negotiated on behalf of these workers and brought about an increase in wage from W star to, let's say it's 12. So let's assume the W star was below 12, which then is going to change some of our relationship here. We're going to find that naturally the producer is going to want some lesser number of units of labor at a higher wage, but we're similarly going to find the suppliers of labor, households, individuals, will be interested in supplying a greater level, in which case we have some mismatch between labor demanded on the part of the firm, labor supplied, and whereas we had zero unemployment when we had this confluence of supply and demand, now we have labor demand being less than labor supply, and we know that that leads us to a condition of unemployment. We've perhaps talked about the exact same phenomena with respect to the minimum wage. So this would be a contract coming into the market. Now, if this contract had, instead of only negotiating the wage, if it negotiated both the wage and the quantity of workers, what might this have looked like? Labor demand, labor, wage, some labor supply. And if we have gone, let's say from, I'll call it 10 is what our W star was perhaps, and let's say it's 30 units of workers, and it moved to 12, we would expect maybe to find that 12 would only require 25 units of labor, assuming on what the actual labor demand relationship was like. But if the contract specified $12, but it also specified 28 workers, then this would create a mismatch such that we would be at 12 and at 28. So we have some friction building in this marketplace because of contracts. We're no longer perfectly equilibrating, but this is changing something about the labor-demand relationship. Let's look at other forms of friction in the marketplace. Let's assume for a moment that we have a market where there is a labor supply, and we think about a labor demand, but now in this market, there's no contract. There's only one consumer of this labor. Let's assume for a moment that this is a mining town, perhaps in Appalachia, and the town is owned by the mine, the employers in the town are owned by the mine, the roads, the houses, the stores, everything is owned by the mine. And so we wouldn't expect to see that the labor supply and labor demand relationship would result in what our wage is going to be. And let's assume, and in this case, the firm, the mine, decided that it didn't want L star number of workers or to pay them some W star, that frankly it only wanted a smaller number of workers. We'll call this L prime, at which point it only was interested in paying W prime, although it might be able to justify W plus. So it found that, in this case, because it was only interested in hiring so many workers, and it was the only employer for labor, miners, let's say, in this town, it only required L prime of them. Based upon their demand relationship, it would have been expected to pay W plus, so an amount greater than W star, but because it knows that this labor supply is at least somewhat captive in this little town, far away from any other employers, that it can get away with paying W prime, or an amount less than W star.